Okay, it's just gone 10 to, so we will make a start. So yeah, welcome again, everybody, to room 3. Absolutely delighted that we've got Nigel speaking to us today. Many of us are familiar with Nigel's work, so really looking forward to hearing him talking to us today about the perspectives of lecturers, language tutors and students on the proofreading of student writing. Just a reminder that you can pop questions in the chat. We'll pick those up afterwards and put them to Nigel, but you can also wait until the 10-minute slot afterwards and just unmute yourself or raise your hand to ask any questions. But yeah, I will hand over to you then, Nigel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eddie. Okay, I'll get going. So this is just a few words about what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it. I'm going to start by talking about what proofreading is, that most problematic of terms. I'm going to talk about how proofreading is a ubiquitous phenomenon on university campuses, even though it may be occluded and we may not see what's going on. I'm going to very briefly look at some research, the literature, and the take-home messages we can get from the literature. I'm going to then go on to my current study and look finally at the implications of my study for universities formulating proofreading policies. So just the obvious, really, this is about proofreading of student essays for assessment rather than, say, proofreading of book manuscripts or anything like that, or those other forms of proofreading. Proofreading is a very difficult, problematic thing to define. We heard that in the talk this morning as well. This was a very Catholic, a very wide, a very broad, you might even say vague definition that myself and some of my co-researchers came up with a few years ago. Third-party interventions entailing written alteration on assessed work in progress. It's intentionally wide and broad because we know from previous research that proofreaders understand their roles in different ways and do different things. There are narrower, more traditional definitions of proofreading, for example, at the bottom of the slide, but the problem is we can't really use those narrow definitions because we know from research that some student proofreaders do far more than just look at typos, hence the wide definition. So now going on very briefly to talk about the literature and the lessons from the literature on proofreading, what they tell us. Joan Turner tells us that students seek out proofreading as a routine part of their lives. Not just Joan, also Nina Conrad recently from Canada has been saying the same thing from her research, that it's quite routine for some students to seek proofreaders. Conrad has also found that it's not just L2 students who seek out proofreaders, L1 students do as well. And indeed, I found that in my research that I've been doing, that I'm going to tell you about. Proofreading does seem to be ubiquitous, but hidden, covert, certainly in the UK, but also in other places, in other university campuses around the world as well. Some more specific findings from the literature. I've already mentioned there's a message that proofreaders vary widely in what they do. Some proofreaders will be more traditional and will just look at grammar and syntax, but I've found in my own work and other people have found in other work that some proofreaders will go much, much further, intervening in content, argumentation, structure, and so on. Another issue, or something that stands out, is that there's disagreement. We heard in the talk this morning, there was disagreement about what the role of proofreaders should be. And again, that's in line with the work that I know that I've cited there. The references are at the end. Students, lecturers, and EAP tutors disagree between and among themselves about how far proofreaders should go. All of this suggests the need for larger, deeper investigations of this kind of thing. It also suggests there are potentially very serious implications for policymakers at university level who are trying to draw up university proofreading policies. And it also links to things like academic integrity as well. So now I'm going to talk about my current study. This is being written up at the moment. So I looked at the views of 3 parties: lecturers, EAP tutors, and students on the ethics of proofreading. Here are my research questions. I'll just let you have a look at those. So the first question is, how far do the 3 parties think it's ethically appropriate for proofreaders to go? The second research question is, are the views of the 3 parties equivalent? And the third research question is a qualitative question, which is about why. Why do they feel the way that they do? So you can see that this is going to be a mixed method study. Here's a word about my research design. I have 122 participants, and you can see I've got people from all 3 parties: lecturers, EAP, tutors, and students. I use 2 methods. I've got questionnaire. The questionnaire displayed 20 authentic proofreader interventions that range from the light touch to the heavier touch, and participants used a Likert scale to determine how ethically acceptable they felt each of these 20 interventions were. The second method was follow-up interviews, where, having done the questionnaire, they then expanded upon their answers in an interview. And you can see that most of the people that filled in the questionnaire also took part in the interviews as well. Not all, but most. The kinds of proofreading in the questionnaire, I drew upon various sources to construct a proofreading taxonomy. There were minor copy editing interventions, and you can see I've got examples of what I mean. So correcting punctuation, for example, moving an apostrophe, substituting a word form. There was major copy editing. This is where the proofreader does a lot more. They might rewrite 6 or more words of the writer's text. There was structural editing, where the proofreader altered the order of sentences or paragraphs. There was content editing, where the proofreader would comment on the quality of the writer's ideas and maybe suggest how to improve those ideas. There was indirect editing, where the proofreader didn't directly give an answer or a correction, but used things like correction symbols or underlining to show there was an issue, and then the writer had to make the correction themselves. Finally, there was non-intervention, where the proofreader, for whatever reason, has decided, although he or she knows there's a mistake in the text, they've decided not to do anything. Show you an example from the questionnaire. So here's a question from the questionnaire. You've got the writer's original text top left, and the writer has written, more students should be enrolled in the experiment. By the way, the student was a Chinese student writing an applied linguistics essay at master's level. The proofreader has added to that text. You can see the proofreaders, more students should be enrolled in the experiment, and then the proofreader has, top right, added, in order to test the hypothesis more effectively. This is an example of content intervention, where the proofreader has enhanced the content of the writer's original sentence. And then you've got the scale at the bottom, and the respondents had to choose whether they agreed, strongly agree, they were unsure, disagree, or disagree strongly with that, the ethics of that intervention. There was a chance to explain their answer, and then, of course, at interview, they could explain in much more detail. So what did I find out then? Okay, I'm going to start with the quantitative findings. I used ANOVAs, and in a nutshell, here are 2 of my findings. So when it came to the more minor forms of proofreading, moving an apostrophe, changing a single word, things like that, there were no significant differences between lecturers, tutors, and students regarding the ethical acceptability of those kinds of changes. In other words, most of the respondents from all 3 parties believed, by and large, those kind of minor changes were ethically acceptable. Similarly, there were no differences between the 3 parties regarding the ethical unacceptability of non-intervention. In other words, all three parties broadly felt when they saw non-intervention, when the proofreader had seen an error, but the proofreader had decided not to correct, most people from all three parties felt that was unacceptable. They felt it was the proofreader's job to correct every error. So those are two results that attracted consensus. However, there were also things that people disagreed about. The story on this slide is that students were more permissive. Students were more permissive about a wider range of proofreading interventions than either the lecturers or the EAP tutors. Students were more permissive regarding major copy editing than tutors, and content editing than either lecturers or tutors. So students were more permissive of heavier touch proofreading. So content editing, for example, where the proofreader changes the content of the text, or rewriting 6 or more words. Students were more permissive and sympathetic towards those kind of changes than tutors or lecturers. The lecturers frequently made references to assessment criteria and the impact that proofreading would have on grades. But the lecturers also said normally linguistic correctness was not what they were looking at when they were marking work. So if there were just minor changes in terms of language accuracy, they didn't have a problem with that. I'm going to show you a quote by an engineering lecturer. She's pointing out here that she's interested in whether the students understand concepts in engineering. She also says, if you look at our assessment criteria when we mark work, the assessment criteria doesn't say anything about can you write very well in English. So she says, I shouldn't be assessing that anyway. What I'm interested in is whether they understand these concepts. That's what she says. But unsurprisingly, when it came to proofreaders commenting on content, there was a lot less sympathy for this kind of proofreading, especially among the lecturers and tutors. So in this example from the questionnaire, we have the proofreader making content changes, or at least asking questions about content. The writer has said there are some limitation. Errors have been left in. There are some limitation. Firstly, subjects may not have been chosen randomly. Secondly, more students should be enrolled. The proofreader has written, you might want to add more detail about these limitations. For example, why is a random sample important, and why should more students have been enrolled in this experiment? So this is a proofreader comment that's at the content level. And this is Andrea the Engineer again, reacting to that questionnaire item. And you can see she hasn't got much sympathy for it. She says it's content, it's not sentence structure, it's not punctuation, it's not grammar. So she says that's not right. She disagreed very strongly with this kind of content level intervention. However, it would be misleading of me to give you the impression that everyone frowned upon content level interventions. Some people were more tolerant about content level interventions as long as the proofreader didn't rewrite the thing for the writer. So here's another example. The writers said, as a result, students in the experimental group developed their abilities. The proofreader's written, how do you know? So because the proofreaders merely asked a question rather than rewritten that sentence for the writer, some people had no problem with this. So Amy, who's a student, argues that this kind of intervention is useful because it makes the writer think, and the writer can either choose to ignore the proofreader's comment or they can run with it. So there were people that said if the proofreader just points out an issue with content or asks a question, that's okay, as long as they don't do the writer's work for them. So you can see that there are different shades here of opinion about how far proofreaders should go. I talked when I presented my quantitative results earlier about consensus. I talked about areas that attracted consensus and areas that didn't. I also want to point out there were some lecturers and EAP tutors who were outliers. So they weren't like most of their colleagues. They were either very much in favor of proofreading or very much against. And I'm going to very briefly show you two people who typify these extreme positions. So the first pseudonyms, obviously. The first person, who I've called Penelope, has a permissive attitude towards proofreading. Penelope is a lecturer. Here's an excerpt from our talk. So she's talking here about the proofreader improving the formality of the register of the writer's text. And I asked her, but isn't register part of the assessment criteria? And she says it is, but she doesn't have a problem with that. She says if the student realizes they don't have the skill to write in that formal academic register, then it's fine for them to go and get the help from anyone, and that includes a proofreader. And she equates it with parents. She says middle-class parents can help their kids because middle-class parents are academically literate. And she says there are some students that come to university from disadvantaged backgrounds and they can't go to their parents. So the proofreader can act as a resource. And she sees proofreading as a way of minimizing disadvantage. Fiona, who is another lecturer, has a very different idea of proofreading, and she doesn't want proofreading at all. In this quote, Fiona's talking about her own module that she teaches and the assessment in it. And she explains in this assessment, students have to write a letter to a client. And because it's a public-facing letter, it's very important for students to get the grammar right, otherwise it looks unprofessional. And so, of course, she says, if a proofreader cleans up the grammar, that completely negates the purposes of the assessment. So she says it's not right, it's not the student's work anymore. I'm giving the mark for something the proofreader's done, not the student. So in Fiona's view, she just wanted all proofreading banned. So as you can see, we've got people that have incompatible views within a single party. Okay, the implications of all this then. Here are a few ideas just to close. Generally, there was a consensus that lighter forms of proofreading were permissible, but when you got into the more heavy editing end, there was less consensus. As we've seen, there was also a difference between students and the other two parties in that students were more relaxed about heavier touch proofreading than either tutors or lecturers. And then I just end with a few possibilities for university policymakers who are thinking about what they should do about proofreading. One idea would be to permit only lighter touch proofreading. The rationale behind that is there's more of a consensus, according to my findings, that lighter touch proofreading is okay than there is for heavier touch proofreading. Another idea is to regulate proofreading by bringing it all in-house. So it's all done in the University Writing Centre, for example. Now, I know there are big problems with this. You can't police proofreading. If someone wants to go and pay or get a friend to do it, you can't stop them. I get it, of course. But if proofreading was taken in-house, it would mean proofreaders could be trained to proofread in a certain way. They could have standardization where the policymakers are making sure that all the in-house proofreadings are pretty much doing the same thing and not exceeding their brief and so on. Then there's the idea that maybe departments could be given a bit of latitude here. I don't know about your own universities, but my university has a blanket policy, which is terrible, by the way. I mean, it's vague and it doesn't mean anything, but they try and have a blanket policy. And I think most universities are like that. The idea here is, rather than having a blanket policy, which is a blunt instrument, we could allow departments, individual departments and individual lecturers to permit or prohibit proofreading from assignment to assignment, because it will depend upon the assessor's aims. So in Fiona's case, Fiona wanted to get them to write a public-facing letter, and grammar's important. Clearly in an assignment like that, it's just not appropriate for it to be proofread. Whereas in other essay type assignments, for example, lecturers may be far less concerned about grammatical correctness and much more concerned about the student's grasp of concepts. In that case, maybe proofreading could be allowed in some form. My references, and thank you very much.
Super stuff, Nigel. Thank you very much indeed. Some really interesting stuff there. I've kept an eye on the chat box. We don't have any questions at the moment, but if there's anybody out there, please raise your hand or unmute yourself, make yourself known, and please do throw them at Nigel. Whilst I'm just having a quick look. Okay, I don't think we've got any so far. Whilst we're waiting, I was wondering as you were talking where the kind of artificial intelligence online software comes into this, and things like language enhancement applications such as Grammarly. Have you any idea kind of, is the differing perceptions between those and proofreaders? Where does that fit in all of this?
Yeah, that's a pertinent question. That there were quite a few participants that mentioned Grammarly, actually, specifically. Some people said, why shouldn't proofreading be allowed in some form, especially the lighter touch forms, because Grammarly does the same kind of thing? So, some people argued, well, Grammarly already does light touch proofreading. You certainly can't prohibit that. So how can you prohibit some light touch form of proofreading? That was one argument that was put forward. Another argument that was put forward was one of the students, I've just been looking at the data, so this is fresh in my mind. One of the students said, proofreading is better than Grammarly because proofreading's more interactive. I can ask a proofreader questions and I can't ask Grammarly meaningful questions. So there were comparisons and contrasts with Grammarly.